Hello, this
Uh,
is an interview for Cast in Stone. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, and I'm joined by, would you please introduce yourself by name, your profession, and mention any associations or groups with which you're associated that are relevant for our interview?
I guess my formal title is Professor Shawn. I'm a professor at University of West of England in Bristol. Um, I'm one of the board members of Fairfield House, Bath, where Haile Selassie lived during Mussolini's invasion. And I'm on the Bristol History Commission as well, that Mayor Marvin Rees set up after the toppling of Colston statue.
Thank you for Professor Shobers for joining us. The purpose of our interview is to discuss the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. Would you please tell me how you came to be interested in the statue of Edward Colston? What brought it to your attention?
It's difficult to say, really. I mean, I've lived in lived in Bristol since 1996. Originally grew up in the city of Bath, just 11 miles down the road. But yes, I started to study in Bristol. Went to college in Bristol in 1991.
Mhm.
Then I think it is around there, meeting Madge Dresser. I met Madge Dresser for the first time in 1991 when I was at college. So this was just like a BTEC college, and she was promoting some event. I think it is a Benjamin Zephaniah event. And then she was just putting flyers around, asking students if they wanted to go to it, sort of thing. She didn't teach there. She just turned up with flyers, just trying to get people to go. And that was the first time I met her. And then very soon after, I got to know her research, her black and white on the buses, and then also her research into transatlantic slavery. So I think it was definitely, I can't pinpoint a time, but it would have been around that time in
Mhm.
1991. And it would have been through the work, I think, of Madge Dresser initially that brought my attention to the Colston statue. I remember I don't know if I was even there, but I definitely remember the story of how when she first talked about the Colston statue to a public in Bristol, and then, a few weeks later, whatever, there's blood paint splattered all over the statue, a few weeks after her talk about it, sort of thing. And I think a lot of people in Bristol of a certain age anyway, would point back to the research of Madge Dresser in terms of first hearing about these connections.
When,
And
when
then,
was that talk?
so that was around 1991, that sort of era.
Mhm. Mhm.
That was around that time. And then I didn't go to university in Bristol, but I moved back there after I did went to Wales for universities, and I actually
Mhm.
moved to Bristol in 1996. Um, and at that point, I was very squarely kind of involved in, primarily as a filmmaker back then, narratives around transatlantic enslavement and legacy, etc. Did a documentary in 1999 with Rob Mitchell, friend and colleague, called Under the Bridge, where we looked at that was the time of the opening of Perrow's Bridge. Perrow's
Mhm.
Bridge is named after John Perrow, enslaved working for off John Pinney off of Park Street and Georgian House. And also 1999 was the year of the Respectable Trade exhibition at the museum, and that was the first time the city had formally acknowledged its connection with transatlantic enslavement with this exhibition, The Respectable Trade. So our film was filmed over a whole year, starting in sort of April 1999 through to April 2000, and we kind of looked at the different things going on, and the narrative of Edward Colston was very squarely in that narrative of that documentary. That was for HTV, ITV West, that documentary. So yeah, it's been knocking around my consciousness in my research since 1991, but squarely in my practice and research since about 1999 onwards from there.
How can people get more information about or see either the film that you produced, Under the Bridge, or the exhibition, The Respectable Trade?
On my website, my film's on there, which is ShawnSobers.com's my website. So if you went to the film section, you'll find it there. It's half an hour long. But we're doing a talk about that in October. It might be October the 17th, I think, for the for the freedom of, what's it called? Festival of Ideas in Bristol. So yeah, we're going to be showing it and talking about it then. And even people like Cleo Lake, the former Lord Mayor of Bristol, back in 1999, she was an invigilator for the exhibition. So she's going to be on the panel with what she's doing. So it's called, I don't know what I think about the title. It's called How Does Bristol Move On Beyond Colston? And yeah, we can get into that really in terms of Colston and how meaningful it was and the toppling of it. You know, we can get into that a bit later, I guess. But it has been a shadow over the city for a long time, the statue, for people that have cared to take notice, you know. So when it got toppled and people were like, well, I didn't know, and, you know, that kind of Daily Mail type response, I was like, well, this didn't come out of a vacuum. This came from somewhere. It's a very privileged position not to know. You know, we've been fully aware of the connection of Colston's statue for however long it is. I don't do maths, but is that 30 years or something, 20 years? And yeah, it's been fully in our consciousness. So whether you're on a bus, going to town, whether you're just shopping, whether you're on your lunch break, you see it there. And this is something I wrote about. Sorry to sort of self-promote. In 2019, I wrote a paper called Bronze and Canvas with Dr. Maya Bertram from the United States. The whole chapter is called Rivers and Oceans, and she wrote about New Orleans and this particular place in New Orleans called Congo Square, and the sort of the culture that exists there. And I wrote about the Colston statue and its relationship with another artifact in Bristol called Soul Down the River, which is a painting by Tony Forbes. And Tony Forbes we interviewed in 1999 when we made Under the Bridge. And in that, he's a self-portrait of him, you know, being dragged into the river and under the bridge, sort of chained up, and the Colston statues behind him, chaining him up and dragging him into the river. So he gave a brilliant interview in that interview about why he chose to present himself in a self-portrait, basically, you know, enslaved or captured by Edward Colston. So in the paper that I wrote with Dr. Moira Bertram, I was kind of comparing these two artifacts and how Bristol sees itself in the narrative. Because in 1999, that painting was part of the Respectable Trade exhibition. So it's commissioned by the council and it's paid for by the council, and it's still on display now in the M Shed. So the council bought that and put it on display. So the M Shed didn't exist back then, but when the M Shed, I don't know what year it was, 2010, I think maybe, when the M Shed came into fruition, the painting went on display there, and it's still on display. So it's permanent as much as anything is permanent in a museum. So, but I did a comparison between these two things because, you know, the statue is how I describe it. It's like a fabric of the city. It's like a building. Yeah, it's welded into the ground. It's grade 2 listed. You see it whether you want to see it or not. You know, like I say, bus, whether you're going shopping, it's there. There's a fabric of the city. The label, and obviously I'm talking about pre-toppling here, the statue. So the label on the statue says, you know, Colston, the wise and virtuous son of the city, and it's very sober how it's written. It's very factual. It feels very factual how it's written. In the museum, to see the Stole Down the River painting, it's on the first floor in a corner. So if you're going to see it, you have to want to see it, or you have to be wanting them to see it. You don't just stumble on it in the same way that you would see the statue. The label on the painting says, this painting is from Tony Forbes's perspective, and it's how he feels about it. So it's very subjective. It's very personalized to Tony Forbes, and in no way is it written in the same sober voice and factual voice as the statue, And I also, again, showing its age, but 2019, I didn't know the thing was going to be toppled. So I talk about how the Colston statue is greatly listed, it's protected, and it's there as a fabric of the city, whereas the painting, even though it's there permanent, it could be taken down in a refresh of the museum overnight, without anyone really noticing, sort of thing. So, yeah, I did a kind of a comparison between these two artifacts and how the city, wants to see itself and the narrative that it's promoting, The other thing I talked about in that paper, but other things as well, is the temporariness of Bristol's initiatives to do with transatlantic slavery. Like some people will say that Bristol hasn't dealt with its city and with its connection with transatlantic slavery, and it keeps sweeping it under the carpet and it hasn't done anything. I would argue that it has done something. It has done lots of things. Since 1999, there's been loads of initiatives and projects and funding and all. There's been lots. You can't say Bristol's not done anything. The problem is that they've all been temporary and nothing has been done. And I think for me, that's the frustration that boiled up on the day that the Colston statues toppled. There's no memorial. There's no education centre. There's nothing. You could argue that there's Parry's Bridge, but Parry's Bridge, that was named after the fact. It wasn't built to be named Parry's Bridge. The design has got nothing to do with enslavement of Africans. Do you know what I mean? So for me, that's like a badge rather than an actual memorial to transatlantic slavery. And the plaque for Parry's Bridge is so hidden, you wouldn't even know it's there anyway. So for me, it's a tension between permanence and temporary. And for me, that's where a lot of that frustration about Colston has come from, really, and why it got toppled.
Thank you. This is very, very helpful. And I shall take a look at your essay, Rivers and Oceans. Who does this statue represent? What did this person do in history? And how did you learn about that?
Yeah, good question. Again, I'm not exactly sure when and where I learned the specifics. Definitely from doing interviews with people, making films, did another film, made other films during the time and other projects in the interview years with Colston. So he's definitely been in the consciousness. And whenever you do a research paper, you always research things brand new anyway to make sure you got your facts right. From my own memory, he was it Director General of the Royal Africa Company? I think that was his title. He wasn't a slaver in the sense didn't have a plantation. He didn't own enslaved Africans. He was in charge of the shipping that went from England to Africa and what they call the trade. But the trafficking, he was in charge of the boats that were involved in the trafficking of, I can't put a number to it, but tens of thousands, if not millions, of Africans were shipped on his trafficking boats. So from Africa, and then went to the Americas, the Caribbean. So he was overseeing that trafficking enterprise. Royal Africa, set up by King Charles the Second and James King James I, I think it was, and became hugely profitable. And what Liverpool previously was the leading slave trading port, the leading port in the United Kingdom for trafficking enslaved Africans, and then Bristol quickly took over and became the leading port for the transportation. So the ships left here. loading down with goods, went to West Africa. Goods came off, human cargo went on, and then over to the Caribbean. So there's no doubt in terms of Colston's role in slavery, and I think it's that. It's the nuance that not everyone involved in slavery was a slave trader or had a plantation. There's many other roles as well. William Braffett, who lived in Durham Park in just off the edge of Bath, which is now a National Trust property. He was an administrator for William of Orange, and during that time, and again, he was underpinning transatlantic and slavery and the colonies through his administrative role, so it goes deeper than just who owned plantations.
Now, the statue of Edward Colston stands in the centre of Bristol, and
Good.
very, very close to that statue is another statue, a statue of Edmund Burke. What relationship is there, if any, between the statue of Edward Colston and the nearby statue of Edmund Burke?
So, yeah, Edmund Burke, he's an interesting figure. I haven't studied him as nearly in as much depth or whatever as Colston, but I know Edmund Burke to be an MP. He is a philosopher. He was a land reformer. The statue was put up just a year before the Colston statue in 1894. And, Edwin Burke's one of these people, particularly as a philosopher, he's kind of, he's seen as a progressive. He was an abolitionist. He did oppose slavery. He did held, but this is the contradictory thing. He also held some abhorrent views about Africans themselves, and said they still need to be civilized, etc. But one of the I guess more complex things about him, that he also thought the same about Europeans. So he thought the civilizing force was Christianity, but he also saw that enslavement made people barbaric in that sense, But at the same time, he did hold some very challenging or questionable views about Africans. But he was an abolitionist. He felt that no one who held a plantation, no slaver should sit in the House of Parliament because it was contradictory to the values of Parliament, So, in that time, we know people like Wilberforce and all that. We know that, their abolitionist views wasn't all about the moral view. A lot of it was self-serving and to do with other well. But in that, sorry, that's my phone going. But in that time, yeah, Edmund Burke was an abolitionist. He did speak out against slavery.
To what extent has there been interactions with or contestation of the statue of Edmund Burke?
None whatsoever. It's all about Colston. And this is the thing that, on the day that the Colston statue was taken down, was toppled, there's other things, Colston Avenue, Colston Street, there's other things in the nearby vicinity, or statues or whatever, that the protesters could have targeted, but it was all at the statue. So that's why when Priti Patel and all these other people were calling it mindless violence, it wasn't whatsoever. It was extremely focused and knowing that this statue represents how the city has been neglecting its role in acknowledging transatlantic enslavement and present day inequality in society. And the Colston statue became a symbol of that blind spot, really. So they took it down, threw it in the river, and then they carried on making the speeches and they went home. It wasn't a riot. They didn't smash anything else. Do you know what I mean? So it's very thick. It's very much about that statue. And
thinking about the day on which the statue was toppled, it was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest. What specifically Black voices or African descended voices have been raised in contestation of this statue?
I mean, many over the years, many, like, since I have to point it back
And
from.
what have those voices, what have those black voices been saying or said?
I mean, it's been a nuance. Many have been saying it should be taken down. You know, if this was a statue of Hitler, or those kind of comparisons have been made. And over the years, there's been lots. There's also been lots of different art projects by black artists that have kind of challenged the Colston statue. Who Locks, one example. Bandelia Yapo. Cleo Lake herself. There's been plenty of people. The poetry, Bristol has a very vibrant art scene. So, and like I say, Tony Forbes as well. So there's been plenty of engagement about the statue and discussion, what should be done about it, etc. There's also been other voices within the black community that have said, don't take it down, leave it where it is, because it's a reminder of what's gone on, and that could equally be sweeping it under the carpet. And I have to say that I was one of those as well. I wasn't one of the people chanting to take it down, because in my mind, in 20 years' time, there's going to be a black student who studies history at the university, and they'll be like, did you know there used to be a statue there, but they've taken it down? It's now being swept under the carpet. So for me, I would rather have stayed there, had a new plaque on it, and that was part of the work as well. A new plaque was actually written to be on there, but then there was all this controversy because the Society of the Merchant Venturers disagreed with the wording, which I think was a bit of an own goal, but I'll explain that in a minute. But they disagreed with the wording, and then it never happened. I'm not exactly sure what year that was. It's about 5 years ago or something. It wasn't that long ago. The reason I say it's a bit of an own goal is that on the wording of the alternative plaque, it made a party political point, because Colston was a Whig, he was a Conservative, but it really made a point of flagging up that he's a Tory. And I just think, well, was that necessary? Do you know what I mean? Like, there was a bigger argument to be made rather than trying to align him with the Tories. Do you know what I mean? But they didn't like wording and it got thrown out. That's my understanding of why it got thrown out, was the party political nuance of it. So for me, for me, anti-racism was not ever about taking down statues and all these kind of things. I think there's the conversation to be had about who is being remembered, who's being celebrated. Same with roads must fall, so those conversations are there. But for me, if the whole emphasis comes about taking down the statue, we're actually missing the point of the bigger anti-racism conversation. Do you know what I mean? For me, it's a bit of a distraction, because all of the energy goes into the statue conversation rather than what the statue represents and what needs to be done for wider anti-racism in those institutions. So for me, even with Colston, it became a big distraction from other things that should have been talked about, really. So, when Audre Lorde said about racism as a distraction, I think Colston was quite a good example of that.
Thank you. When did the question of the statue's future in public space arise in your city? And where did the request for a consultation and a commission come from?
So in terms of the statue itself, I mean, like I say, it's been an ongoing thing. So I remember in 1999, there was a protest against Cabot. There was a Cabot 500. So John Cabot was the founder, quote unquote, founder of Newfoundland, who sailed from Bristol on the ship called the Matthew. And we had the thing called the Festival of the Sea. But before that, there was the Cabot 500, which is the 500th anniversary of John Cabot's sailing and discovery, quote unquote, to Newfoundland. And so people were like, hang on a minute, John Cabot, that was the beginning of the colonial period. Yeah. John Cabot wasn't an enslaver, but it definitely opened the doors and to that period of colonialism. And then the Matthew the ship got refurbished. You can still see it now. It's in the docks in Bristol. Huge amount of money spent on it, and it sailed back over to Newfoundland in that Cabot 500 year. So there's been lots of, over the years, particularly because it's a port city, and we've got a thing called the Festival of the Sea, which celebrates the maritime history of the city. There's been lots, so there hasn't been just one specific time, but I would say definitely over from 19. Again, it does point back to this 1999 year, because that's when a lot of these Cabot 500, it's all happened around that time. There has been lots of debates. We had a massive debate in 2007, the abolition year, around should Bristol apologise for slavery, and that was a whole big thing, and the Colston statue was raised in that debate as well. That was a debate in the passenger shed next to Temple Mead Station, and I can't remember if that's the one Jesse Jackson was at. He was there for some. I can't remember if it's the same event or a different event, but anyway, it was a packed audience for that. There's lots of hunger in the city for that conversation. Even the respectable trade exhibition in 1999 had the biggest audience the Museum had ever seen. And the only thing that surpassed that is the Banksy exhibition that happened, in, I don't know, whatever year that was, 2007 or whatever it was. So there's been a big appetite in Bristol to just know more. And Colston has been in the heart of that. In terms of your question about the commission, I don't know exactly where that came from. I think it was more of a, there's already the legacy steering group, which is looking specifically at the legacy of transatlantic slavery in Bristol, how it should be memorialised, and that is its direct remit. There's a bit of confusion with the History Commission, because the History Commission was never set up specifically to only look at the legacy of transatlantic enslavement. It's really set up to look at the wider history of the city and how it can be reconciled and discussed, but using the Colston statue as the starting point of that discussion. So because it got set up in the aftermath of the Colston statue, lots of people thought that the History Commission had the remit for looking at the memorialisation of the transatlantic slavery going forward. But that was always going to be this legacy steering group, which is chaired by Asher Craig, the deputy mayor, who is African heritage.
You say that the History Commission was set up with a brief to look at the wider history of Bristol. What is your understanding of that phrase when it comes to the original brief of the We Are Bristol History Commission? What would have been the wider history that the commission would have explored?
I guess the wider history in relation to narratives that aren't usually told, hasn't had much exposure, women's history, working class history, as well as, migration histories and present day narratives. So looking at that wider context of Bristol as a city of flux, as a city of solidarity movements and those kind of things, beyond strictly and only the African legacy and narrative.
And yet this History Commission was set up immediately after the toppling of a statue of an enslaver. Why was the response to that toppling to set up a commission with a brief that was wider than enslavement?
I think really it's kind of just trying to grapple with this conversation, because it split the city in half in terms of the urgency, I guess, the perceived urgency of it. And I think it would have been a distraction for the legacy steering group to have to take on that remit when their agenda predated the toppling quite considerably. The conversation about the legacy of how transatlantic, our ancestors, how our African ancestors should be memorialised, That was on the table a long time before the Colston statue was toppled.
Mhm.
So their agenda didn't need to be derailed by this one moment of the Colston statue, which I can absolutely tell you, it absolutely was all-consuming, you know. So I think it was a good thing for this other entity to take on that immediate conversation. So one of the things that we were doing was I was involved directly in the curation of the we call it a display rather than an exhibition, but the curation of the display in the M shed of the statue, which opened a year after it was toppled. So I was working with the curators at the M shed and, you know, the wording and the placement. So yeah, directly involved in all that.
How
And
did you
then
come? How did you come to decide to display the statue of Edward Colston, which had been dumped in the harbour? Um, what were the decisions that you took, or the considerations that you took into account when putting together that display?
we felt a display was needed because that wasn't the end of the conversation. You know, like I said, it really did rupture the city in two. And we're most, you know, people of Bristol, we're most interested. How do people of Bristol feel? Do you know what I mean? Obviously, it's a wider narrative, and when it toppled, it ricocheted across the world. It didn't just stop in Bristol city gates, but at the same time, it's important that we heard what Bristolians themselves had to say about this
Mm-hmm.
city, you know, about this issue. You know, and Colston's one of these figures that, as I say, the Royal African Company, all of his involvement in transatlantic enslavement, he was also a big benefactor, philanthropist, and he gave loads of money to charity. So that's why in the city he's got this reputation, which is very, you know, dual-headed. It's very, very complex and tangled, and both things are true at the same time. Absolutely, gave a huge amount to charity, and absolutely, he was involved in the trafficking of Africans. Both those things are true at the same time. So, in the display, we felt it was important to, in a way, wind back to say this didn't happen in a vacuum. You know, this is what happened. Here is the statue, and contextually around it, these are the reasons why, the voices, the newspaper articles that have been happening for decades, and the conversation, the opinions, the timeline. We had a timeline that went back, I don't know, like 100 or so years of all different things that have happened with the statue around it, or yeah, or in the centre of it. So, you know, looking at countering Colston and their you know, their protest against Colston. So again, you know, Cleo Lake, Ros Martin, Christina Edwards, and these people. So yeah, we thought it was important to put it in context, and so people in Bristol can see this is the debate. This is what's happening. Again, it wasn't mindless violence. This was a very specific thing with a very particular narrative and part of Bristol's history now going forward.
So all of what you've just said might have been might perhaps have been achieved by placing the many opinions that you had encountered in some sort of display. But you also chose to display the materiality of the statue itself. What led you to do that? And what choices did you make in how to display that materiality?
Yeah, I mean, really complex. There's lots of conversation about the statue. If it was up to us, we would have just opened the doors of the warehouse of the museum and let people see it in the dusty warehouse, covered with rags and turpentine next to it. Do you know what I mean? In the context of the museum, rather than put it, and this is why we call it a display rather than an exhibition, because it was never meant to be an exhibition, like a permanent exhibition and blah, blah, blah. We wanted to show it in quite a raw state, how it was. It was never going to stay in the river. You know, people are saying, why don't you leave it in the river? It was never going to stay in the river. This is a big statue that's obviously, you know, very culturally valuable. I'll put it that way, culturally significant. No council's going to let that stay in the river. That is just not going to happen. Do you know what I mean? You shouldn't be throwing crisp packets in the river, let alone leave a statue in the river. So that's just not That wasn't ever an option, really. So it was salvaged the next day after it went in the river, and there it lived in the warehouse of the museum. It was very unstable, so it was, the thing was falling apart. So the museum created a wooden cradle for it to sit in, led down. So it kind of sat in this cradle, and it was in that cradle where, there's lots of graffiti and all this sort of stuff sprayed onto the statue before it was put in the river. So the conservationists at the museum made sure that graffiti stayed on there. It didn't flake off. It wasn't wiped off. They wanted to preserve the statue in the state it was now in, rather than trying to preserve it what it was like before.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in that same cradle that it was exhibited in the display. A new display cradle wasn't made for it. Do you know what I mean? That was all posh and like exhibition worthy. It was shown in the same raw state that it was in the warehouse. There was lots of conversation about would it be stood up, would it be on its side, would it be let down, and all this kind of stuff. We felt if it was stood back up, that would be reversing the what happened. Do you know what I mean? The thing was toppled, and it was now let down.
Yeah.
So to actually stand it back up, we felt is making a statement of it being put back up. We didn't feel that was appropriate at all. And even then, even if we was going to stand it up, it would have cost a huge amount of money because you would have needed a crane to hold it, because otherwise the thing would have fallen apart, while a new cradle was made to allow it to stand up. So even financially, it wasn't worth it to make it stand up. But we felt it'd been quite distasteful to make it stand up anyway. So the let down position is the position that was in the warehouse when it's being preserved, and it was literally wheeled out of the warehouse and put in that space. There's also conversation about would people be able to walk around it or not, what position in the space it was going to be shown in, so there's all these connotations. Would it feel like it's a funeral, like lying in state, all these kind of connotations. We had all these conversations. In the end, you couldn't walk around it. You could see it from the side, but you couldn't walk around it in a 360-degree way, so it's buttoned up against the wall kind of thing.
Now, Professor Sobers, could I just check in with you? We've reached 3:00. Do you have any flexibility to continue after 3?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, carry on.
Okay. I'll be mindful and conservative with your time. Thank you.
Yeah.
What was your reaction or response to the suggestion that the statue in the display was lying in state?
I mean, there's so many different connotations that you can have, and as an arts lecturer, I know that nothing has a fixed meaning. I could look at a painting and you could look at a painting, and we'll both have completely different responses to it. And that's the same with an exhibition, same with a display. But we did preempt or understand that one of the connotations could be that, we had those conversations quite extensively. But I guess the explanation, one, that you can't walk all the way around it, two, that it wasn't led down deliberately. That's the state it was in. And quite frankly, there's no position you could have put it in I think the only position you could have probably put it in would have been literally have it upside down.
Why didn't you have it upside down?
Because that would have cost a huge amount of money to put it upside down. And again, you would have had the finances. I would rather that money go somewhere else rather than displaying Colston's statue. It wouldn't have been realistic in the middle of a pandemic as well. This was all being curated in the middle of to make that thing upside down, which is really heavy, which is falling apart. It would have cost about £25,000 to do that. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So, but one last question on the display. Was it, and if it was, why imperative to have the statue in the display?
I think in a way we just felt that it was needed. The city, this thing happened. It's a museum. It's the museum's role to have these conversations around artifacts that are relevant to the discussion of the history of the city. And that is the role. The M Shed is the Museum of Bristol, essentially. It has that. The other museum has the Egyptology, has all these other things. The M Shed tells the story of Bristol, and this was a very specific event that happened in the city. So, yeah, we felt that it was necessary for the statue to be there, for people to see it, to people to engage in it, and particularly so you're not preaching to the converted. There's plenty of people that had no idea about the Colston statue before it was toppled. They didn't know Colston was a slave trader, anything like that. Do you know what I mean? So it's important that you're not preaching to the converted. We know what it was. And we also did lots of pains to actually make sure that if you didn't want to see the exhibition, it's not beholden to that. So you can see the thing online. We know. Why would we want, and I was very conscious of this, why would we want people of African descent to have to go to the museum to see the statue they've always hated, particularly COVID, when we're just coming out of lockdown and all these kind of things. But you could engage with it online. I'd like to talk about the survey as well that we did.
Yes, let's move on to that then. So We Are History Bristol.
Just to close the point, but we felt it was important that the statue was there to bring in new people to that conversation. This thing happened. They're interested. They went to see it, and they can see the wider context around it. Without the statue there, you wouldn't have had that footfall. We wouldn't have drawn that audience.
I hear you. So the We Are History Bristol Commission also conducted a survey of the city and produced a report grounded in the data yielded by that survey. How was this survey constructed? How was the data analysed? And how was the report and the recommendation and the recommendations, how were they put together? What was your role in that?
Yeah, so again, this is why we call it a display, not an exhibition, because the survey was always going to be central to that display, the survey. It's very carefully put together. Again, the height of lockdown, so it wasn't always easy to have that communication flow when you're not in front of people. But it was a partnership between, again, the MShed staff and the council departments, the public engagement departments, and the Bristol History Commission. That we would come up with questions, they would come up with questions, then we discuss it. And I have to take my hat off to particularly the museum staff. They were very careful throughout the whole process, really careful, really mindful, and I was always really impressed with the thoughtfulness that they gave absolutely everything. Do you know what I mean? And I was really encouraged by their carefulness throughout the whole process, really. So essentially we wanted it to be, what do the people of Bristol, how do they feel about this history? There was a number of questions that we put forward around, what would you want to see happen next, and these kind of things. What do you think? What should happen with the statue afterwards? So a whole range. I can't remember the exact figure of people that responded now. I think it was it 13,000 or 30,000? There's a lot of people that responded.
Professor Sobers, how many questions were there, and what were the questions?
To be honest, I don't have it in front of me now. Otherwise, I'm not sure if I've got it in front of me now. But there was a range of questions. I mean, one of the most telling results for me, there was about 15, 20, something like that. I can't remember, but around that figure. But one of the most telling results for me was, did you agree with the statue being toppled in relation to age? When it came to ethnicity, that question around ethnicity, it was kind of a 50-50 people that agreed versus people that didn't disagreed with it when they broke it down to ethnicity. So black Bristolians and white Bristolians, about the same amount of people disagreed and agreed. And it was I think, around sort of the 80% mark that agreed and others disagreed. But it was in the majority of people that agreed. The big telling figure for all of us really was the age. So when it came to the agree, disagree, there's literally a diagonal. Youngest agreed. And as people got older and older and older, more people disagreed. And so the biggest disparity was generational rather than ethnicity in terms of people that disagreed or agreed. In terms of ethnicity, like I said earlier, I spoke about, how I know plenty of black people that were like, it shouldn't have been toppled. We need to leave it there to have a conversation. So I fully understand that view. There's also people talking about, well, even white people said, well, I didn't agree with it, but they didn't agree with the criminality, quote unquote, of it being taken down. So there's a nuance. It's not the case that everyone who disagreed loved Colston. It's not the case that everyone who disagreed was in favour of transatlantic slavery and didn't see it as important. Do you know what I mean? There's a more nuanced conversation than that, really. But definitely generational rather than ethnicity with the biggest disparity.
So you mentioned ethnicity with regards to the survey. To what extent were people who were not racialized as white, and specifically people who are racialized as black, responding to the survey? What did you do to increase responses from people racialized as black to the survey, and how successful do you think you were in doing that?
I mean, you could always do more, but yeah, we worked with the neighbourhoods team at Bristol City Council, and they did workshops in various locations to do that. And, we shared it personally on our own networks and things like that, and tried to do lots of outreach. Again, it was in lockdown, so, these things are never easy. But we definitely had a higher response. Again, I don't have the figures, and I don't retain figures easily, but we definitely had a higher response rate, from people identifying as black than would usually respond to a museum exhibition. And also the response rate for a survey was a lot higher across all demographics. The response rate was a lot higher than any other museum survey or whatever that they've done in the past, just again because it's so high in the public consciousness. So we were pleased. By no means you catching everybody, by no means is it perfect, but we definitely felt that it definitely captured a snapshot of people's feelings and managed to capture some of those voices in terms of demographic, but nothing's a perfect catchment.
You mentioned the Legacy Steering Group, perhaps now the Bristol Legacy Group. That also commissioned a consultation and a report with recommendations, Project Truth. What are the similarities and what are the differences between the two consultations, the two reports, and crucially, the recommendations made by each?
Yeah. So we were very careful in the report that we did around Colston consultation. One of the recommendations, and there's not even a recommendation because it was already mandated for the Legacy Steering Group to do the work they do, but we were very careful to put a statement in the report to say the responsibility or the mandate of the conversation, the people that hold the conversation going forward about how transatlantic slavery is memorialised permanently in the city rests with the Legacy Steering Group. That's not the job for the History Commission. We wanted to make that very clear. I know everyone in the Legacy Steering Group. Do you know what I mean? And they know everyone in our group. So it's really careful that we weren't overlapping in the sense of stepping on each other's toes, or we were very clear with the wording that this is as far as this consultation goes with the Colston statute. But any conversation about transatlantic enslavement, that conversation rests with the legacy steering group, and they take the lead on that. In terms of,
can I just stop you there? I mean, there is a distinction that you're making between memorialization of Colston and memorialization of transatlantic enslavement. In what way is memorialization of Colston not part of memorialization of transatlantic enslavement, given what you said Colston's role in history was?
Because that's about Colston. For me, if there was ever a museum in Bristol about Bristol's role in transatlantic slavery, Colston and even that statue would be a small corner in a much bigger narrative. He's not the central figure, you know. So I worded it slightly clumsily there, because it's not about the memorialization of Colston. It's about the survey of what happens next with the Colston statue, etc. So it's not about memorializing Colston.
Okay.
But yeah, but you know, the legacy steering group, you know, like myself, I mean, I got fed up of the name Colston, you know, by the end of that year, if not even before. Do you know what I mean? It's like just overtakes everything when there's other things you can talk about. So yeah, the Colston statue and his role, important as it is, that shouldn't overshadow the memorialization of people of African descent and our ancestors who was victims of the slave trade. That's not censoring Colston.
What role did you take in the consultation that was led by Project Truth and the report that it produced?
I was involved. I fill out the survey. You know, I went to the meetings and things like that. I wasn't a lead on it because I'm not a member of the legacy steering group. So, but I've been to their meetings. They've invited me as a meeting and a link person between the History Commission and the legacy steering group. And actually, you know, the first time I went there, it felt like I was, you know, they were like, oh yeah, this is where I belong, sort of thing, you know. But yeah, but you know, I wasn't a lead person on it. That was very much Cleo Lake and you know, and the people there.
But you were the link between the two groupings.
Yeah. So I attended legacy steering group meetings and told them what the History Commission were doing and how we were taking forward things and things like that. And just to quickly answer your earlier question about what the recommendations were, again, I'm not going to remember them all, but one of the recommendations was definitely that that the statue should remain in its current state and not be cleansed of the graffiti and that sort of stuff. So the listing of the grade 2 listing should now be updated to encompass the graffiti and that sort of stuff. We another recommendation was that a new plaque, after the abandoned attempt a few years ago, a new plaque is put on the plinth that's there. And we actually, to stop it hitting a cul-de-sac, we went as far as writing what that new wording could be on the plaque. So even if they're going to change it, they at least got a starting point. They don't have an excuse to kick it down the hill, sort of thing. That was ratified by the council, so that was agreed in principle. Not sure what's happening with it now. It's got a bit quiet, but that was agreed in a full cabinet meeting in the council. Another recommendation was that there should be a permanent, a future display of the Colston statue, but with the wider context of transatlantic slavery told in that context. So it's not told in isolation. It's told with a fuller history around it. Another recommendation was about the plinth itself, I think, and how, you know, we didn't suggest what should be put on there. I think we talked about it remaining empty and possibly be used for a space of conversation and arts, and a bit like Speaker's Corner, you know, as a space where people can have a conversation about transatlantic slavery, but also inequality, and a space for people to congregate, etc. And you definitely see now with the empty plinth, people stop and talk. They didn't do that when the statue was there, but they do that now he's not there because it's become a place that people recognise.
Mm,
I don't remember all the rest of the recommendations, but they're the core ones that I do remember.
thank you. Um, you were among a small number of people racialized as Black on the History Commission that was set up. It may even be given apologies that were sent for meetings that you ended up as being the only person racialized as Black at many meetings. What do you think that had as an impact upon the way in which discussions were held and decisions were reached by the We Are Bristol History Commission?
I don't see it as any, really. I mean, Edson's on there. Olivet was on there to begin with, but then she had to step down due to overwork, etc. But yeah, I don't know. I don't see it had any. Everyone on the History Commission is very, got people like Steve Paul, has been very embedded in this narrative of history. Joanna Birch Brown, Tim Cole, so no one on that History Commission is conservative and was swaying in a different direction. Do you know what I mean? So we can make conversation about how people who are racialized as white see things different to people who are racialized as Black in terms of these conversations. But I didn't get any tension of anything being watered down, anything being swept under the carpet. It's very much a case of, no, this needs to be told, this needs to be this needs to be out in the forefront, etc., etc. And that's just not me. That's not me being liberal. That's just me being honest. I didn't see any tension in that whatsoever. I can make a cheap point and play to the crowd and say there was, but being completely honest, I didn't see that whatsoever. But one thing I do kick myself about, and it's an own goal, and I'm very up for admitting mistakes, that and again, I blame it on lockdown, seeing everything on a screen and not having time, but we're all busy and T's not crossed and I's not dotted sort of thing. But for me, when I saw the exhibition for the first time, the display for the first time, one thing that I really regretted was not noticing that the Society of the Merchant Venturers was not mentioned in the actual wording. It's mentioned in the timeline, but it's not mentioned in the wording. And I had to hold my hand up to say that was a mission. It wasn't a conspiracy. On Twitter, Society of Merchant Venturers aren't worded. It must be because there's lots of assumptions that the Society of Merchant Venturers were funding the History Commission. They offered to give us money, but we said no. Do you know what I mean? And that was in the very first meeting we ever had. But we've never had any conversation with the merchant venturers. We're not, there's no connection whatsoever, But it doesn't look good when you suddenly realise, shit, they're not mentioned in the bloody. And me, big thing. So as soon as I realised that, and seeing noise on Twitter that raised my consciousness to it, that I asked for. There's certain headlines, particularly in relation to countering Colston. So, for example, I think it was Christina Edwards. Is it Christina Edwards? Asked for the Society of Merchant Venturers to be disbanded, and it became a headline on the Evening Post, on the local newspaper. So there were certain headlines that we found because we had a digital wall next to the statue itself that had the different headlines over the years. So I made sure that those headlines about the merchant venturers were added to that wall. So at least they were in there, but they just weren't in the graphics that were printed on the wall, kind of thing. So it was it was a post-rational bodge, thing. But at least it was in there. But yeah, I definitely kicking myself about that. And at any future exhibition, as I heard, I mean, I'm not involved in the new exhibition, but I heard there's a new exhibition being planned. But like I said, I haven't had any involvement in that. But I would want the Society of Merchant Ventures to be named very squarely in that interpretation, in the narrative, because it just opens up to criticism and conspiracy accusations and stuff. So even based on this conversation, I need to contact the M Shed and find out what is happening. I heard it by rumour that a new exhibition was being planned, so I need to contact them.
Now, this is my penultimate question. If after my last question you have other things that you'd like to raise or put on record that my questions haven't enabled you to say, please do take the opportunity to offer them. You mentioned that you filled out the survey or participated in the consultation led by Project Truth. To what extent did any of those questions or did any of those conversations mention the statue, and what sort of things were said either by you or by other people who took part?
So I'm a bit wary of that question just because I don't remember. It's just such a long time ago. I don't recall Project Truth being interested in the Colston statue. I may be wrong, but I would have to look at it again. But I'm not sure if there was any questions about the Colston statue in Project Truth. I don't think there was, because that wasn't their focus. Even in the meeting with the Legacy Steering Group, they weren't interested in the Colston statue. Do you know what I mean? Because it just wasn't a priority. Again, they saw it as a distraction. They know as part of the narrative, but I think they're also glad that they weren't having to deal with it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I think there's also the sense that, yeah, the Colston statue, yeah, but I mean, I had to do, in the sense, there's dirty work having to deal with the Colston statue. It wasn't liked by all that it's put on display. It wasn't liked by all that the attention was being given to that, etc., etc. Do you know what I mean? It's the dirty work, really. So I don't remember any questions about the Colston statue or conversation about the Colston statue as a focus by Project Truth for Legacies. But I might be wrong. But they more important conversation again, which is why they weren't mandated to be distracted by the toppling of the statue when it happened.
This is my final question. We've mentioned Black voices raised prior to 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. In the survey conducted by the We Are Bristol History Commission, and also in the consultation conducted by Project Truth. To what extent, reflecting upon these Black voices raised in contestation, have these Black voices been listened to?
I think they have, but at the same time, well, have these Black voices been listened to? In terms of the recommendations from the reports, they were put to the council in terms of what happens next and the plaque and those kind of things. And yeah, nothing has happened yet. Like I say, that the decision for a new plaque was agreed in the council meeting. But yeah, haven't seen anything on that. The last I heard was that no, it's definitely been agreed, and there was a vote on it, so it was agreed. But I haven't seen any of that. So I guess it remains to be seen. And for me, the remains to be seen is what happens next in terms of the Legacy Steering Group. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the memorialisation, how seriously that's taken. Will it just continue to be temporary, or will there be some actual investment into this narrative? But not only the historical narrative, but I'm also personally interested in a education centre, a place that researchers can go and research this history. So it isn't just swept under the carpet each time. For me, I'm not that I wouldn't be satisfied if it was a statue or memorialization, a bronze memorialization to transatlantic enslavement, and that only. Do you know what I mean? For me, it would have to be something more substantial, and that hasn't happened yet. There's definitely been noises. So until that happens, I'm not sure if we have been listened to. So it
Professor
remains to be
Shawn?
it remains to be seen what investment is put in. We're not going to have a mayor this time next year, so the council's going to completely change its structure. So will this just continue? I mean, and quite frankly, we're sick of it in Bristol. You know, as Madhu said, we've been having these conversations for the past 30, 40 years about these conversations. They just keep going in a cycle, and we're fed up with it, quite frankly. We want to see a different conversation emerge. So at the moment, they've been listened to but not acted on. So I think that's an open question.
Professor Shawn Sobers, thank you very much for sharing with us your perspective on the contestation of the statue of Edward Colston.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. It's good. Yeah, it's good. Sorry I couldn't remember all dates and all the questions, but it's important that I come at this without, do you know what I mean? Pre-preparing is what, you know. So, but the report, if you can put a link on the website to the report, because there is an online version of the report. So yeah, if you're able to do that, then they can see people can see in more detail.
Very much so. I'll stop the recording now. Unless you wish to say anything else for the record.
That's fine. Okay. That's fine.